Now, that was shocking to me because the coach and I had not worked that out in advance. And yet, these kids took him up on it. All 50 or 60 of these kids lined up to take me on the mat. I decided at that moment that I was going to die. That seemed to be the only conclusion I could come to. There was murder in those eyes. And I said to myself as I looked at Jerry Tully at the head of the line, Jerry, you're so very anxious to be wherever I am. I'm just about to depart this universe. In order for you to follow me, you're going to have to depart this universe. Now, since I was the only one who understood the entire dynamic, I would have to become the instrument of his demise. And Jerry came after me on that mat, and I sidestepped him and got him down in a headlock. He had worn a set of military dog tags that day with a metal chain around his neck. I simply grabbed that chain as an instrument to restrict his air supply, and Jerry Tully started to choke to death. He started to turn blue and gasp for air, and the coach ran over and said, okay, that's enough, in a very disgusted voice, stop it. And we did, and he shooed us outside the gym while he stayed inside the gym, which of course was not a Phi Beta Kappa move on his part, because you have to imagine that in the aftermath of what just happened on that wrestling mat, something else is going to shape up outside. And while I didn't know what it was going to be, I knew without one shred of doubt that I was going to have some sort of a starring role in it. So we get outside, and all of a sudden I find myself encircled by that same group. I didn't know what was going to happen, but then walking toward me on the periphery, from the periphery of that circle, came this senior named Macaulay. Macaulay was a big kid, one of the football players of the school, the kind of person who has no neck. And there's Macaulay with a baseball bat in his right hand, walking toward me very deliberately. And all of a sudden we find ourselves face to face, this close, breathing on each other. And Macaulay's got that bat waggling back and forth. And he looked at me very intently from that very close posture, and he said to me, nigger, if you weren't so small. And he dropped the bat and walked away. Now that was a dramatic moment in my life. Macaulay had discovered a spark of humanity that he couldn't override. He refused to take advantage of a smaller human being. I sometimes refer to that as salvation by stature. But whatever works, it allowed me to be here with you today. Well, after a time, I made my way back to the gym, and now the idea was to get a shower and get back into the school routine. But I knew taking a shower was going to be quite an ordeal because I had to contend with all the hot water jets turned in my direction and broken glass sprinkled on the floor. And I took a quick shower, which isn't saying a lot because all of my showers that year were lightning fast. I completed that shower and raced down to my locker, and here I made what could have been a fatal mistake. I forgot to maintain high-level vigilance. And during that year, if you did not maintain high-level vigilance, you were in big trouble. While I was fumbling with that lock trying to open it, somebody snuck up behind me and threw a combination lock as hard as he could, caught me on the side of the head, and wham! I don't know if you've ever been hit on the head really hard, but it feels like the whole world's exploding. I went down on one knee, I could feel the blood trickling down my head. But as I did that, I could sense people running toward me, and I realized that if I went all the way down, possibly I would never get up. So I happened to maintain some semblance of balance against those lockers, went into the coach's office, which fortunately was nearby, and he looks up, and there I am, soaking wet, totally naked, bleeding from this head wound. He runs out to see if he could catch the guys responsible. They had disappeared. He came back. I got first aid. I got dried off. I opened that locker, and as I opened the locker, water came cascading out. Somebody had been there ahead of time and filled that locker up to the air vent with water. All of my clothing was soaking wet. Now I faced an awful dilemma, because in order to get dry clothing, I have to call home. I have to make a phone call to my mom. Now, even though she and I have not talked about it, I know for a fact that she's hovering over that phone, and every time it rings, and I tell you, it rings incessantly, before one ring is complete, she has that phone up to her ear because she does not want to miss the call that says to her, your son is no longer among the living. So I hesitate. But eventually I do make the call because I have to. It's my only alternative. We make that exchange, dry clothes for wet clothes, and we go on about the day. 20 years later, that scene came crashing back to mind because By that time, my mom and I and the whole family had moved from Little Rock to Los Angeles. And on this particular day, this 20 years later, my mom and I are having lunch together, and she turns to me, and in her wry kind of way, she says to me, "Terry, do you remember that school you used to go to in Little Rock?" I said, "Well, yeah." She said, "Well, you know what? I never told you this, but during that time, somebody called me up one day, and in a very official voice said, 'Mrs. Roberts, I regret to have to inform you, but your son Terrence has been savagely beaten. He's been beaten by a group of men wielding tire irons, and I don't know if he'll live for another half hour.'" She went over the edge psychologically. Eventually, she was able to compose herself enough to make it up to the school, where the principal escorted her to my classroom. She looked in there and saw that I was okay. Nothing had happened, but the psychological damage had been done. And as she told me that story, 20 years after the fact, my mind went racing back to that day in the gym when I hesitated to call. And also, I could feel chill bumps up my spine because I had no clue about the cost paid by my parents. It was an awful time. I learned a lot about fear that year. I learned a lot about what can happen when people don't want you to do what is right. I learned also that you cannot color code this thing. Not every single white person in Little Rock was my enemy. Not every single black person was my friend. And I say that because I think it's so vital for us to get the message that the thing goes far beyond racial group membership. Dr. Martin Luther King was killed down in Memphis because his message began to change when he got down there organizing these garbage workers across racial lines. He began to understand it wasn't a black thing or a white thing, but it was about a disparity of income. It was about a gap in wealth. It was about a power elite in this country that preferred to keep most of us in ignorance, who preferred to sit up there in their throne-like positions looking down on us while we play a giant game of let's you and him fight. That was the kind of thing that we had to fight against at that time, had to fight against, and have to fight against today. We as individuals have to take charge of whatever we can take charge of. And the one thing that stands out for me